So hi everyone, welcome to our session. We're going to be talking about GitProxy and it's a bit of an echo, but it's okay. We'll be talking about GitProxy and we'll be seeing how you can get your code out of your organization more quickly, easier and securely. So, who are we? Well, I'm Katrina Waugh, used to be called Katrina Novakovic, if you remember the name and you're confused who I am. Recently got married. And I work at City as our open source culture lead, and I also lead our inner source efforts.
Hey everyone, I'm Jamie. A lot of familiar faces. Good to see you all. I'm the operations lead for City's open source program office. Prior to that, I did my own startup in open source security, which was acquired last year by a company called Protect AI. You may have heard of it. And my job is fairly simple. My remit is to get developers at City contributing to open source. That's it.
So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to look at the state of open source in financial services. We're going to look at what is GitProxy, how it's evolved. We'll give you a demo of it so you can see it for yourself. We'll look at how the project has grown over a time, the community and the code contributions. We'll give you some in real life examples of how people are using GitProxy. And then it also will give an opportunity to see how you yourselves can get involved. So let's start by looking at the state of open source software in financial services. So every year, Finos run a report. They survey financial institutions to find out how they're using open source in terms of code contributions, leadership, governance, all kind of things. And the latest report they had was released in September 2024. And within this report, they found that 46% of respondents say that their organizations are allocating more time for them to contribute to open source, which is great. There's more people contributing. And the report also says that part of the reason for this increase is that people are implementing more automated processes to make it easier and get rid of the manual steps that are involved. And one of the ways to automate processes that they mentioned in the report is using GitProxy, the tool that we're talking about today. So the report summarizes that contributions continue to increase, but more policies and tools are needed.
So I think the question stands, why are developers contributing to open source potentially under the hood? Why are developers and organizations afraid? As Kat mentioned, tooling, policy, a lot of this stuff is missing. So developers, when they come to their organization and perhaps they've engaged with open source before, they may worry about the existence or not necessarily knowing about the existence of these policies and being like, oh, what if I break the rules? What will happen? Will I get in trouble? Will it affect my score, my bonuses? Is there a risk there? Of course, contribution and the associated has major data and IP leakage risks, right? And I think this is the common one that we would all immediately go to. You know, a lot of large institutions in the room, but also developers, right? I mean, they're not silly. They know that they might put something in there that they may not necessarily want on the public internet by mistake. And that stuff can happen pretty easily. Of course, licensing and legal disputes. You know, an example I always give is, if someone were to go onto Stack Overflow and copy a piece of code on behalf of an organization contributing to open source, where's the lineage? How do we know where that code has come from? How do we know they haven't even taken a snippet from an internal repository and just stuck it in and pushed it out the network on behalf of one of our organizations? And again, maybe the risk is bigger for organizations like City, but generally speaking, the risk is still there. It doesn't change too greatly. And of course, other contribution risks and concerns from enterprises like ours is low return on investment, right? There are developers contributing to open source in our organizations, as well as in small organizations. But the question is, can we understand what they're contributing to, why they're contributing to it, and is there a benefit to the organization? And invariably, the answer is probably yes, but if we don't have that insight, it can be defunded, it can mean people are moved away from doing those activities, discouraged from it, even though it benefits the organization. So, what is GitProxy? Ooh. So GitProxy, we tried to get a nice simple sentence. Think of it as a firewall for code and Git operations inside your enterprise network. So I'd probably liken it to when you're sending an email, let's say it's your payslip, there's a reason you can send your payslip from an organization like ours to your personal email, right? Because it's useful to have that information outside of the network. But let's say you had a PowerPoint, maybe like this one, or something that was a bit more confidential to be kept inside of your company. Well, there are scans, email scans that occur that prevent that from leaving the network. You know, things that look at the metadata of the file, things that look at the size of the file, things that may capture what the file is called. So liken the two, right? But this is specifically for code. So rather than emails, we're looking at code files, code content, things that developers are doing on an everyday basis. So you imagine a developer clones a repo through GitProxy, they write their code as usual, they push their code to via GitProxy. We do all of our scanning. Think of it like a push protection, like that email firewall, so to speak. It looks at the contents of the code that has been pushed. And then once we're happy with the contents of it and it's been approved, go ahead and push it out to the public network, in this case, open source. So breaking it down a little, you can imagine it like this, right? I described some of those email rules. It could be file size, it could be file name, it could be file contents. But in our scenario with code, there are other things that we might be interested in as well for code. So it could be, what is the license associated with the file that's being pushed? Are there any license headers or information pertaining to the license in the repository that we can extract and get some sort of auditability around? Are there any secrets? This is a really obvious one. And funnily enough, you know, when we speak to lots of organizations about GitProxy, this is usually the first one they jump to. It's like secrets. But there is so much more. You know, this is not just a secrets opportunity, and it's invariably not even necessarily the riskiest one. Data's a big one. CSV files, TXT files, log files, JSON files, right? They can include a lot of concerning things to organizations like ours. And bear in mind, even if data is not necessarily production or real data, and let's call it test data, there are concerns, policies around this for larger institutions where that sort of stuff still needs to be scanned and audited. So you can imagine any kind of rule you want to come up with, you describe it, you enforce it in policy, and before code leaves your organization, again, likening it to the email firewall, the email check as an email leaves, you choose your rules, you write them, and GitProxy will enforce them over the code. And developer experience is important. Oh gosh, going back to my startup days, comes in every so often. But it's true, right? This is not going to necessarily be adopted, and adopted well if developers don't get it. It's not easy to use, and it doesn't sit where the developer sits, which we know terminal, CLI, VS Code, IDEs. This is where we want GitProxy to sit, and it does. So when a developer is pushing their code via GitProxy and they're targeting it towards an open source repository, this is where we will tell them and give them feedback on what is in the code that could be problematic and how they can make adjustments to ensure it's now ready to go and leave the organization. So in this case, an author, the author email on the commit does not match a company domain, as an example, like @city.com. So some of the benefits of GitProxy. This slide is, I say, a little outdated. I mean, it's fairly recent, but we've had a lot of contribution recently from entities in the finance world. So this is really quickly growing, expanding, getting better. But enforcing custom push protections, you get a diff-based view of codes, especially from a especially from a diff-based view of the code for auditability. So if we wanted to go back in time and see what code left the organization, what were the changes, who did it, that's the sort of thing GitProxy can offer. And of course, it's very much config-based, right? So we support all different types of usages, infrastructure, deployment models, authorization models. So let's say you wanted to use Active Directory as an example instead of something locally. This is something we can support. And generally, it serves as a nice point of information dissemination. Ugh, that's horrible. It's just centralized information. So if a developer wants to see what are the projects that an organization is contributing to, we've got that inventory and the licenses associated with them as well.
So now we'll have a look at how GitProxy has evolved over time. So within City, we had an internal project that we wanted to open source, and we had never done this before, and to try and get the code out of the organization for the first time was very tricky. There was a lot of people involved and a lot of processes that we had to do. And there was one guy working with us called Paul Groves that you may have heard of and heard him speak before. He decided one weekend just to knock up a quick system to try and automate all the manual processes. And that's how GitProxy was created. He did a POC that was well received, and then the next weekend he went in and did the MVP. And there was a lot of positive feedback that he had, and so that's how it all got created. And then we actually open sourced GitProxy. So we open sourced GitProxy by using GitProxy to get it out of the organization. And if you were in the talks earlier today, you heard about why it's beneficial to have a foundation host your project rather than an organization. And that's exactly what we did. And GitProxy is now hosted by Finos. And once we had it hosted by Finos, we attracted more organizations within the financial services. And over time, this has just grown and grown. And we've had RBC, NatWest, they've publicly spoken about GitProxy and how they've been using it. And we've increased the number of contributors and also maintainers for the project. And it's great that it's not just City people, there's lots of other organizations, big names, but also smaller names, and globally as well, from all around. And the more people we have involved, we've increased collaboration, diversity, and innovation. And this has led to new features being implemented. So for example, we now have plugins, which we'll cover a bit later, but this just makes it easier for people to contribute back to the project. We also had a City hackathon in India that was powered by Finos with us. And part of that, we had a lot of contributions into the GitProxy project. So having hackathons as well involved is a great way for people to just start contributing to open source in the first place, but also help out the GitProxy project. And then we've also had industry recognition. So Jamie here actually won the most active contributor, and that was due to all the contributions that were happening around the GitProxy project. So that was at the Finos OSFF 24. And then recently, last year, we won the Open UK Awards 2024 in the finance category for GitProxy. So it's great to see that the open source project is getting recognition, and it's kind of up against big other names and companies, and it's just growing, and it's really helping people.
Okay, demo. All right, so I'm going to walk you through what GitProxy looks like for a developer, someone pushing code. So we're going to go through a simple story, which is, I'm a developer. Hey, everyone. We're going to remove some unused dependencies, libraries in a repository, right? Fairly trivial task. So I've got my GitHub issue. I've described what it is I want to do. I'm going to use something called dep check. It's an npm dependency, and it will go through my manifest of libraries that I'm using for my project and tell me which ones are just not being used. They're no longer required. That's it. So the normal flow, this is public GitHub. I'm going to go ahead and clone directly from it. So I've got my clone URL there. This is probably something we're all very familiar with, even if we're not doing it on a public GitHub. I'm going to go and grab that URL. And now, inside the organization, right, this is behind the company network, inside of it, rather, I'm going to go ahead and run that git clone. Now, depending on the organization, certain things may or may not happen. In some companies, that request may fulfill. In other companies, it may just fail entirely because there are possibly network controls that restrict it, right? So this is where GitProxy comes in. So OSPO now, hey, Jamie from the OSPO, I'm going to go ahead and run a local instance of GitProxy. So let's go ahead and get that started up. All right, well, hey, this is our local instance. Now you can see you've got some repositories there, a bit of a dashboard, but not to go into too much detail right now. Now, instead of going directly to GitHub, I'm now going to go and get this clone URL, right? See the difference? It's pointing to localhost, right? And remember, this is running on a local machine, but you can imagine it would be a deployed URL, a deployed endpoint. And I'm going to go ahead and clone that repository, right? So this is still speaking to the public GitProxy repository, as if I was speaking directly to GitHub, but instead of going directly to it, it's going through GitProxy first, the local instance. But again, that will be a deployed instance of it. Just to point out, one of the reasons I may be able to do that is because GitProxy enforces, identity access, right? So here I'm listed as someone who can contribute. Now, what's quite nice is GitProxy today has fleshed out a lot of the use cases around pushing, right? But we've actually got pull and push access, so we could enforce who can pull code and who can push code, and what can they pull and what can they push. That's something that's doable today. So just going over that, via our config, we've said that we want to proxy the URL github.com, and we want to point all traffic onwards to it at some port. Now, to be specific, this could be GitHub, it could be GitLab, it could be Bitbucket, it could be your own Git server. We are completely unopinionated. All we want is, where do you want us to pull the traffic from? Where do you want us to send it to? That's about it. So I'm going to go ahead and verify the clone just to make it painfully clear what's going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and ask for the remote origin URL. Now, this would typically be, if I was working at home on open source, github.com/finos gitproxy.git. But you saw in this case, it was the local host that we were cloning from. So that's where we're going to be submitting and pushes to and pulling new code in from. So let's crack on with the activity. I'm going to create a new branch for development, just to start working on the task. Don't need to show you that too much. Now let's go ahead and run the dep check utility. It's going to show us which of the libraries are no longer being used. So we've now got a little list back. Cool, all right, so it looks like all of these ones, apart from concurrently, is being used. Don't worry too much about the detail, but these are some changes I need to make to my package.json. I need to remove these apart from concurrently. So I'm going to go ahead and make those changes. I remove those dependencies from my package.json. This is what the diff would look like, a code change, right? And you can see that at the top there. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my changes and write up a commit. So git commit, chore, remove unused dependencies, and I'm going to put by city. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and push that branch. I'm going to push it upstream, right? And bear in mind this is going through GitProxy. Cool. Now we've seen a response from GitProxy, which is, your push has been blocked. Please ensure commit messages do not contain sensitive information or URLs. Now let's go ahead and look at why that happened. So again, all config based. We've described that anything that is a commit message that's coming through GitProxy should not include some pattern. And in this case, we're basically saying, company.star. It was, city.star. So because the commit message included this specific content, GitProxy blocked it from flowing through and leaving the network, right? And of course, fully configurable. You can write patterns. You can write literal strings. It can be quite literally anything you want it to be. So let's go ahead and push with a new commit message. So I'm going to go add again, write out my new commit message, remove unused dependencies, and I'm just going to put in the issue number at the end there. And then I'm going to go ahead and push to the upstream. Cool, all right, successfully pushed to GitProxy, and we can now see this URL that's been spat out. Now, what that URL is alluding to is a specific bit of content in the GitProxy dashboard, GitProxy servers database, right? So we can see at the top here, this is the contribution that's now sitting in GitProxy in a pending state. And this is where the review would happen, right? So we can see the changes. We've got a diff-based view of the code. And now someone can come in and approve. Now, to be very specific, the first and usual question is, well, how much of this can be automated? Simple answer is pretty much all of it. It just depends on your risk tolerance, right? Broadly speaking, secret searching, scanning for data, scanning for usage of non-standard cryptography, whatever it is, we can track this stuff. Today's flow, we do have a manual step though. For us, it's about taking as much content we can to the reviewer, giving them everything they need so they don't have to scan, one all the way to hundreds of files, right? So kind of like a PR review process, but very much up to the organization how much friction they do and don't want there. We also have an attestation form, right? We ensure that the person who's reviewing the content understands exactly what it is they're doing. This is also configurable, so they understand, that this is code that is being open source. They understand it's going to the public internet, and they're agreeing to certain statements when they click this button. We also track auditability of those approvals, right? It's important to us that we know who pushed the code, but also who allowed it to leave the organization, who was the person that gave that AOK. And then once it's got that AOK, that approval, we're going to repush the code to GitHub. You can see the usual push command, and in this case, you can see a server response that's coming directly from GitHub, right? This is not a GitProxy response. This is coming from public GitHub, from inside of the company network. And that's about it. It's really not that complex. Pull the code, push again, leaves the network. Do your scans in the middle. That's about it. So here we're closing out the GitHub issue. And yeah, check it out on GitHub. We're always looking for contributors. New ideas are welcome. So yeah. So project growth and being mindful of time. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride. I joined City two years ago, 2 months ago, and we've done pretty well. We've got some really good enterprise adoption. Lots of finance companies, of course, coming out of the Finos ecosystem. We've also got various vendors who are trying to commercialize GitProxy. Companies that are looking to use GitProxy as a value add to their existing suite of products. And of course, that naturally helps with growth. As we get contributors and consumers, it kind of starts the wheel. We're also pretty big on events and social media. We try and make the documentation site as accessible as possible. We try and keep our community up to date with what it is we're doing, what events we're attending, and show off our success. I think if we put the success in front of our contributors and our community, it makes them feel excited, naturally, that what they're doing is having an impact. Of course, stewardship and leadership is really important. So, getting maintainers from organizations like ours involved. So we've got City, we've got RBC, NatWest, who have really driven it. And I'm not just saying that because it's like, ooh, Finos is working. No, literally, these are people who are, spending time putting code, not on paper, but in terminal, pushing up and making real contributions that we mutually benefit from. So it's a great arrangement, and it works really well. Of course, activity and contributions. Our biggest contributor is not actually finance. It's just, I don't want to say people on the internet, but it basically is. Of course, we have our core contributors, our core maintainers from the finance world, and some vendors, securities vendors, but realistically, most of our contributors are people we've never met. They're people who want to just get involved with open source and, of course, are interested in supply chain security and finance. Lastly, community engagement, going to events like this, standing up, talking about GitProxy kind of helps propel it. It helps reinforce relationships we already have. So always a beneficial one. And of course, technical debt and efficiency. So looking to automate a lot of the processes around contribution, getting people started, it's a really big one, especially as we try and scale and move away from, just 1 or 2 or 3 people maintaining a repository to trying to get as many as possible contributing and taking some of that burden off of core contributors. So happy to say contributors are growing, and yes, we are still young. It's still a fairly young project, but in production in some large organizations. So I'm proud about that. We've done a very good job. Contributors are growing. We'd love to see you on that graph, although you probably wouldn't be able to discern yourself, but imagine you could. We'd love to see you on it. And as I said, there's a huge amount of opportunity. Forget, our understanding the, how the project works, where it sits. There's so much we can do and we need to speed up development, speed up adoption, and it sits in, a myriad of these sorts of things where we require contribution, involvement from you folks and from others around the world. So it makes a massive difference. It makes my job easier. It makes the maintainers' lives easier, and it even propels new contributors because it gives them, salt to their contribution. So now we're going to go into a few quick IRL, in real life examples. So simply put, we had 3 open source or to be open source projects that were created inside of City. They're parallelization libraries, which you can now find under github.com/City. These are projects that we maintain, that we authored, and originated as, I guess you could say, like inner source or internal projects that were being used by a couple teams. And we couldn't just throw those over the email. We couldn't just push them out directly to public GitHub. And so naturally, given that GitProxy existed and we'd already had about a year and a half at this point of GitProxy being used, we just pushed all 3 libraries through GitProxy. So that was around 40,000, 50,000 lines of code scanned. And yeah, I mean, we met our internal policy requirements. We have auditability. We ran through all the secrets checks automatically. We looked through sensitive information checks automatically. And yeah, look, it's a pretty simple example, but it's pretty powerful, right? Because I think this is where the concern comes. If I went to an organization and said, go ahead and push out 40, 50,000 lines of code, they'd either laugh at me or spend a year to 2 to 3 years figuring out how to do that. So hopefully we can alleviate some of that, and I think this definitely demonstrates that we did. And the push itself for all 3 took about a week from start to finish. So yeah, it's pretty quick.
And then at City, it's optional to contribute to open source, but if you choose to, you have to take some open source training. And the process when we first started was very manual. You had to request that you wanted to contribute to open source and then go through the approvals process. And then you were asked to take the open source training that we had internally. And then you had to do a manual kind of export of those who had taken the training, match that up with those that requested to take it, and then go, yep, you've done the training, there you go, you can now contribute. And this was a very manual process. So it was the training team had to send a spreadsheet, which they could either send like daily, but that was a bit much. So they ended up doing it on a weekly basis, and then I would have to find time to match it all up. If the training team went on holiday, there was a delay. If I was busy on holiday, there was a delay. So it wasn't the ideal process. And luckily, GitProxy came in.
Yeah, exactly. So APIs are a thing. They've been a thing for a long time. There's no reason we have to do all these manual things that Kat described. So easy to configure, easy to describe the policy. We went ahead and looked at our training API. Has this person completed a training course? If they have, let the code leave the organization. If they haven't, go and retake the training, and we can make that information available via the CLI and also the dashboard. So yeah, again, pretty simple, but actually fairly powerful.
Yeah, so now it's your opportunity to get involved. So if you haven't already, check out github.com/finos/git-proxy. And we'd love it if you could give us a follow. We want to increase our stars that we've got on there. And there's all kind of ways to get involved. So take a look at the issues. I believe there's ones tagged with kind of first contributors, so you can pick up some easy ones that are good. And we've also got community calls that you can join. So go ahead and take a look at the project and see how you can get involved. So we're going to open it up now for any questions or discussions that you want to have. Carl, am I coming with the microphone doing it?
You briefly mentioned pre-approved repositories for contribution. Is that a default part of the model? Is there anything that GitProxy can do with help getting those approved? I'm thinking like small projects, little libraries, somebody wants to contribute a one-line fix. Does that involve, does it create too much overhead getting a project approved to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what is the process of getting new projects approved? Let's say it was a small contribution, a bug fix, a vulnerability, making an adjustment to some documentation. So today it's kind of up to the company, but the vision for GitProxy is very much putting policy around pull, right? Because we've got enough information to at least kick off governance on behalf of the developer when they make that pull or that clone command. So today we don't do that, but we want to do it. City's very much interested in that, and we have what we need to do it. So let's say I'm a developer, I want to make a contribution to React, and I want to bump a library because there's a vulnerability in it. For some reason, I'm the first person who's been made aware of that. So I could go ahead and clone through GitProxy, right? At that point in time, we've now got the information that this person has cloned this repository, but we don't actually know what they want to work on yet. Cool, we don't even need that right now. The developer can then go ahead and start working on what they need to work on. Again, nothing's really changed apart from where they're cloning. Basically no friction, apart from knowing they have to clone from GitProxy, this deployed instance. So granted, there's a little thing there. They go ahead, they work on their code, they make their change, and then at point of submission or push to GitProxy, that's where we could manually and or automatically start doing more governance, which is, okay, how many lines of code changed? What changed? Was it a package.json? Was it 5,000 files? Was it 10 megabytes? Was it 1 megabyte, right? So GitProxy can do that. It's just how you want to orchestrate your developer experience, where you want to put your governance, but because of how GitProxy works, because of technically what's possible with it, yeah, the friction could be extremely low, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's marginal for GitProxy, but I was wondering how long did it take to get out one of an internal project entirely open source outside?
So was the question, how long did it take to get a project from inside of the company network to open source?
A brand new project from inside could have been GitProxy or one of the libraries you published?
Yeah, great question. So to be honest, at the start it took a while. So to get GitProxy out using GitProxy, of course, naturally there was a bit of fear. It's like, oh, should we really trust GitProxy? And we're just relying on this bit of code. But I think with anything, as it gains experience and proves its worth, the confidence increases, maturity generally increases. So with GitProxy, at the very beginning, I don't know, maybe like 4 to 6 months. But with these 3 libraries, which each library has pretty much more code than GitProxy, all 3 took about a week. So we went from about 2 years ago, 6 months, to, I don't know, 5x, 10x more code per library for 3 libraries, and did all 3 in a week. So yeah, pretty good improvement, yeah.
I think just to note as well, different organizations will have different ways of doing it, but if you have a project that you want to push out, you'll get the whole, why do you want to push this project out? What's the benefit? What's the gain for the organization? All this kind of stuff. There's a lot of people involved. So all that is a long time in the process. The actual pushing the code out bit is a small part of it. Any other questions?
Hi. I don't know if you can hear me for this. I was just wondering, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. So I was just wondering in terms of roadmap, what might be coming next, or what is the kind of things that would be needed, because that seems quite mature product.
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So Kat mentioned a new architecture. RBC has been a rock star called plugins, right? And plugins is describing the policies that we at City will require and implementing them in code, and building these community-driven plugins that are essentially useful for that. Which is, yeah, we want to build consensus with other companies around what are the sorts of things that they want to be looking for in their code, because invariably when I do my kind of outreach and meet with many organizations, both large enterprise and small, they don't actually know what to look for. They all just say secrets, and it is just not the only thing, and it's probably not the biggest thing, right? IP leakage is a big thing. Lack of clarity on what code left, what was the license. I mean, that's just a there's not a huge amount there. So plugins, very much so. And then also around Chris's question, which was how to improve the developer experience generally speaking. So can we apply policy at the clone, at the pull? What does that look like? Improving better auditability and trailing breadcrumbs of code as it moves through the entire process, starting off from cloning all the way to pushing and letting code leave the, leaving the network, leaving the organization. So there's some improvements to be made there. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty much it. Yeah, better developer experience and working on the plugins. And there's a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Any further questions? One.
Sorry, can I just one more thing? I'm not aware of the policies at CT, but how does it work? Is it that you can't clone any GitHub repositories without going through GitProxy, or is it that you could before, but now you can't because you've got GitProxy and you've got complete control over what goes in and out, basically?
Yeah, so that's one of those questions where I'm told. So if anyone asks about specific processes, you just say, you can't answer. So let me try and think of a way of answering it. I've seen organizations, sound like a diplomat. I've seen many organizations that do both the blocking entirely, so developers cannot clone. And I've seen organizations that allow cloning of code, but when it comes to things like push, post, put, those type of network level requests, it's just completely impossible. So it's all the way from completely locked down, can't even get on github.com and require some sort of privilege escalation for getting to it via the browser, getting get requests, pushing post requests, all the way to some, if not potentially, not really, all of it being permissible. So being able to request full write access to public GitHub, pull access, get access, whatever it is. We sit in there somewhere. Yeah.
Sorry, just one more question, I think. So the first thing I thought about when I arrived and I saw what you were describing, I thought about GitHub Advanced Security, right? Now, one advantage I understand of GitProxy is that I can go to any Git repository provider, so not just GitHub, let's say. But,
correct, yeah.
But with, I suppose GitHub Advanced Security, does that change your roadmap in some ways, or does that complicate things, or because supposedly then you end up having rules in different places that do exactly the same thing, like secret management and don't put the name of the company, or for example things like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it doesn't complement. It actually does complement it. It doesn't complicate it. So one of the things that I think needs work is the plugins ecosystem, and I think it makes sense for it to be open source. I even think secrets management to a large degree, like as we've seen and as even GitHub has seen, like there's a big element of public do good, right? Like none of us want secret keys, tokens in public code, and I think we can say the same for things like data. I think we can say the things for like the usage of non-standard cryptography. We can say the same for things around the usage of licenses, approved, unapproved, right? And they're common problems. Like these are problems that a lot of the institutions we're working with have, and I don't think it necessarily makes sense to solve these as proprietary closed source problems, right? We can equally and mutually benefit off of all of them. It doesn't mean there's not necessarily an incentive to commercialize. There potentially is, right? Like you could have an organization that may want to build like a deep tech scanning plugin, where they protect the source, they make it very proprietary, and they don't open source it. So I think if anything, there's an incentive and a complement here for us to work with GitHub and be like, okay, like what are the enumeration of all the different types of issues we should be looking for in code? Because it is definitely not just secrets, right? And I'm not just saying that because, that's how we differ from GitHub. It's more, we have an open source contribution policy, and I haven't completed my job and met the requirements of that policy until I actually check the code automatically for all of those issues, not just secrets. And it falls under, data, it falls under non-standard cryptography and encryption, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, pretty much a complement.
And that's it, we've run out of time. I can see still some questions at the back, but we can speak to you after the presentation. So thank you everyone for joining us, and remember, come and like us and give us a star. Thank you.